Good morning, good evening. Joel Leyden broadcasting for the Israel News Agency this morning or evening, depending upon where you are, whether it be New York, Chicago, or Tel Aviv or Haifa. We have with us Colonel Miri Eisen, who had served with the Israel Defense Forces for many years. I had the great pleasure of serving with Miri in the IDF. Miri is still so very, very beautiful, where I have lost a lot of hair and gained a lot of weight.
See, that's one of the advantages of, what we women are allowed to do.
Yes, yes. And what we'll be discussing in this hour's program with Miri is what's going on. Where did all of this balagan, in Hebrew means confusion, this craziness, where did all this craziness begin in terms of Gaza, in terms of Hamas, in terms of the firing of rockets into Israel, the firing of rockets into Israel from Lebanon, from Syria? But let's start with, how are you, Miri?
So Joel, it's really a pleasure to be talking to you, to the Israel News Agency. It's Sunday, Yom Rishon, but here in Israel, it's already Erev Chag, and I love the holiday of Shavuot. There's something about it which always, it's a very much an agricultural holiday. It's about when you're cutting down the wheat. It's also about the Torah reading. And I was just before we were starting in the afternoon in Israel here, sitting and reading the magnificent book of Ruth, which is the most calming element you can do in a world with rockets and tensions and Jerusalem and everything going on. Out of my window, I can see in my backyard a beautiful pomegranate tree. And I love pomegranates. They're a beautiful fruit, one of the 7 species of the Bible. And so it's much quieter than you'd think. And I don't know what will be happening. I know that they just had again sirens in different areas down south. Today, as of now, it's in the afternoon in Israel. So far, I've been spared the siren of the day.
So you had served with the IDF for how many years and what positions, Miri?
I served for over 20 years. I did most of my positions in the Israeli intelligence community in a variety of different positions. I also had the opportunity in my service to serve as an adjutant. I was the adjutant to the chief of staff and the personal assistant to the director of military intelligence. After I retired, I also served for 2 years, not in uniform anymore, but most of you, the viewers, remember me from then when I was the government spokesperson during the Second Lebanon War, which is already 16 years ago, hard to believe, 15 years ago, wow, okay, 2006, and I served in the Prime Minister's office for 2 years.
And what positions do you hold today?
So I've been teaching at a lovely private college called IDC-Herzliya. I imagine that many of you have children or grandchildren who study there. It's a very excellent college here in the center of Israel in Herzliya. I teach in the School of Government. I teach a variety of different classes. My favorite right now, Joel, is a graduate class called Intelligence in the 21st Century. And week by week, we joke about the events of the week, and then suddenly we talk about them. And so this week, and I know me in a terrible sense of humor, we were talking about targeting, and then all of this started. Targeting and intelligence. It was like, okay, let's talk about the relevance of the moment.
Where are you speaking from? I mean, if you can't disclose, what town, are you in south, are you central, are you north?
Yeah, I'm in central Israel. I live next to Tel Aviv in a suburb of Tel Aviv called Ramat HaSharon. I'm at home right now. My husband, one of the kids, I have 2 other children who serve, and they're both in service right now in their compulsory service.
Okay, now my understanding is, as we're speaking right now, we have rockets. We have, I believe it's over 2,500 rockets that have been fired from Gaza into Israel. In addition to that, we've had rockets being fired into Israel from the north. And the IDF, the Israel Air Force, and some of our ground troops are engaged in terms of trying to eliminate the sources of fire, trying to eliminate the Hamas operatives that have been involved. And so there's a great amount of cross exchange. There's also a good amount of ignorance outside of Israel in terms of what's happening, a lot of misleading headlines in the media, and I would like to address that with you. But can you tell us right now, how did all this start?
One of those questions that Joel likes to ask me of how did it all start? And for every person listening, where it starts very much depends on how you view the Middle East, how you view Israel, how you view the conflict, on where this specific, very heightened amount of violence, I'm going to allow myself to call it a war. It's not being called a war right now. For me in Israel, it feels like a war. Where did it start? Because it did not start, and today is Sunday, a little under a week ago, Monday at 6 p.m., when Hamas fired rockets towards the city of Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. But that was the day that you overseas started to hear about it, meaning from last Monday, 6:02 p.m., when Hamas fired rockets at Jerusalem, it hit the international media, and from there, Israel's response against Hamas in the Gaza Strip to that firing of rocket, and it turned into being Israel against Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who are the rulers of the Gaza Strip, who have built an infrastructure of terror, as the Israeli chief of staff calls it, a terror army. In the Gaza Strip, Israel has been fighting with the best of its forces to contain, stop, and even if we're not going to be stopping the rockets, we are absolutely attacking in the different ways we can so that they will change their capabilities completely in the aftermath. It's not a happy picture, but that's just this last week. Were you asking about what led up to that firing of rockets by Hamas 6:02 on Monday?
Yes. Was there a pretense? Was there an excuse?
So there's always an excuse. We exist. That's always a good excuse. Having said that, remember, Hamas as an organization calls for our destruction. I am not, and I'm very careful with my words, I'm not talking about all Palestinians. I'm not talking about all Arabs. I'm not talking about Iranians as Iranians. And I will be talking about Hamas leadership, Palestinian Islamic Jihad leadership, about all of the fighters, that terror army that they have. And I say that because in its own way, and this is a very odd way to put it, I am aware of that, anybody who has a calendar could have looked and seen years ago that in the first 2 weeks of May 2021, there would be a combination of very important religious, national, Middle Eastern, Israeli, Muslim, Jewish dates that all came into the same 2 weeks of May 2021. And in its own way, part of what happened, I'm not going to blame the calendar, but it was the combination of Ramadan that changes its location on the calendar every year. And every year it is a tenseful time in the holy city of Jerusalem, the capital of the state of Israel, the weekly prayers up on Friday on the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa compound. That's always a point of friction, of challenge. The night where they break fast and it's a celebration iftar. This year up front, every evening that break fast in Jerusalem was very tense, and growing tensions on specifically the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa compound. When I say it is a setting, when I say it is an excuse, I want to be clear to everybody. Al-Aqsa, the mosque itself, and the Temple Mount compound, which is run by the Waqf, is the third holiest site for Islam. They did not make this up in the 20th century. It was defined as a holy site to Islam in the 7th century. We can all have lots of differences of opinion about what that means. Physically, the structures themselves, the entire compound, is built on the 2,000-year-old remnants of the Temple Mount from the time of King Herod, from the destruction by the Romans. It's the exact same place. I'm going to call it Temple Mount. They're going to call it Al-Aqsa compound. But the month of Ramadan always brings up friction because there are several important dates during the month of Ramadan, when they're fasting during the day, break fast at night iftar, which are directly connected to Al-Aqsa, to the Holy Compound. And this year, 2021, the year where Israel is starting to come out of Corona, and I hope that you do too, where Israel is the one where we vaccinate all of the citizens of Israel and the East Jerusalemites. And I know this is an odd aspect, but the East Jerusalemites, vaccinated as residents of the state of Israel, can have no problem to be able to go up and pray at the Al-Aqsa compound, pray at the Temple Mount, to go up there, in its odd way under Israeli leadership, ruler. They can go up under the auspice of the police, but this year there has been over friction. There are legal issues in the background. You're going to read right now as we're talking. There's an event going on, a bad event, a violent event in a neighborhood of Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, which was in the background of these things. But legal issues are not the ones that bring everything out.
All right, so let me,
Everything
all right,
out.
so let me, I'm interrupting you, but that's very Israeli, so I'm allowed to.
Exactly.
That's part of my Israeli experience. So let's get back to Jerusalem for a second. Much of the international media were reporting that this entire thing started with the Israelis trying to evict, trying to throw Palestinians out of their homes in East Jerusalem. Can you articulate something about that?
For the last 50, I've been here with 1967 until we're in 2021. For the last 54 years, Israel has been sovereign in Jerusalem. Joel, that's something I'm very proud of. We are sovereign in Jerusalem. It is the capital of the state of Israel. It is the unified capital of the state of Israel. East Jerusalemites from 1967. They are not citizens of the state of Israel. They are full residents. It's a legal status in the state of Israel. They do not recognize East Jerusalemites that have grown a lot in numbers. They don't recognize the state of Israel, the jurisdiction of the state of Israel. They're also not citizens of the state of Israel. And I hate to put it in such stark terms, but I want people to understand it. There are over 20,000 illegal structures in Jerusalem, so that aspect of illegal construction, of the legal aspect of East Jerusalemites, they don't recognize our courts. Let me
take another foot backwards. Is there an East Jerusalem?
There is. Don't ignore it. They don't have citizenship, which means that they already have, because of that, Joel, a different status than I do as a citizen of Israel, and they have a different status than a Palestinian who lives in the West Bank, who is under the Palestinian Authority. And they're different from the Arab citizens of Israel who have full citizenship, passports, vote and are voted in and out of the Israeli Knesset. So even though we may not like the term, they absolutely exist.
All right, so we're talking about Israeli status or international status, or both?
So again, in Israel, as they are not citizens of Israel, they are residents. In Israel, we call the residents of East Jerusalem, East Jerusalemites, Mizrach Yerushalmin. There is no other term in Hebrew. And I would say that that's something that along the long road, it was one of the 6 core issues for any kind of real status agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. Jerusalem is at the heart of it. The East Jerusalemites is among others. The biggest point of contention would be who gets to be sovereign over Jerusalem, over the holy set places. And the eviction in Sheikh Jarrah is not about the eviction. It's about the recognition of Israel's right to apply the rule of law in East Jerusalem. Meaning, and I must say in that sense, I don't want it to be about the eviction in Sheikh Jarrah, but I know that the international media has been focusing on that. It's a legal aspect, but the international world, the international media, breathe deep, North Americans, even the United States of America that recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That doesn't mean that they recognize Israel's full sovereignty over, let's say, East Jerusalemites, etc. Meaning that for me, aside from the United States, perhaps, any other place in the world, not just the Palestinians, do not recognize Israel's sovereignty over the areas of East Jerusalem. So it's presented in that kind of framing. But I'm Israeli. We took responsibility. We have the rule of law. It has been through the courts. It has gone through every single level. These people there, there's no question whatsoever. It is not a pretty picture. By the way, I would never go into the legal profession, but when I say it isn't a pretty picture, that doesn't mean it's illegal under Israeli law. These people are squatters. They were supposed to have paid rent. This has been in courts for over 40 years. They refuse to pay rent. They don't recognize Israel. They don't recognize the status of the courts. And so the court at the end said, after 30 years that they're not paying rent, as I said, it's been in the courts for many years, that they need to be evicted. 3 families already were. This is the 4th family. Doesn't make it any better. And Joel, to be clear, behind the Israeli legal aspect of that have been Israeli groups who also have agendas. Don't let anybody in that sense, it isn't an easy situation. There are ideologies, there are agendas, and at the end, there's the rule of law. I accept, recognize fully the rule of law in the state of Israel. That doesn't mean I always agree, but it's the rule of law through the legislation as it is, including within the city of Jerusalem.
Is East Jerusalem occupied?
Not for me as an Israeli. That does not resolve the status of the people who live in East Jerusalem. Let's not make it easier for us.
So when people,
else,
including the international media, might refer to East Jerusalem being occupied, are they also referring to the Western Wall being occupied?
that would include, so everybody likes nowadays to show it in their own different aspect. Life has gone on a lot, water under the bridge in that sense. Most people don't understand what it means when we say Jerusalem, when we talk about the Holy Basin, when we talk about both the Western Wall and the Temple Mount. They don't understand the proximity, the distances. You have to come here and view it with your own eyes to understand that the physical, not the hypothetical, the physical platform upon which the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Golden Dome of the Rock stand, that huge platform that they love to show in every single film anywhere, was built 2,000 years ago for a Jewish temple. But Joel, we both agree the Jewish temple is not there. It was destroyed 2,000 years ago. And on that platform, 1,400 years ago, the Muslims placed their structures, and it is the 3rd holiest site for them. And who gets the honor to be the sovereign? Israel took that honor very openly in 1967. We've applied the rule of law, not just in the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa compound, and all of East Jerusalem. We applied in such a way for freedom of religion. And I hope that some of you, in the midst of all the craziness that's happening, this last Friday, today is Sunday, which is the Friday, the Muslims are right now at the end of the holiday that comes at the end of Ramadan, Eid al-Fitr. And there were tens of thousands of Muslims, mainly East Jerusalemites, Arabs, praying up on the Temple Mount, that same arena that had the horrific confrontations in the weeks of Ramadan, on the Friday of Eid al-Fitr, this last Friday, full open prayer, and because the police are there to keep the rule of law, to make sure that nobody breaks the law.
Yes, I wanted to ask you. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, do the Israelis permit freedom of religion? Are they restricting Muslims from praying in Jerusalem?
The Israelis abide, the Israeli government and the police are the ones who enact that. The Israelis chose in 1967 to go to what we call the status quo of the holy places, which means that the Temple Mount with the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Golden Dome of the Rock, the entire compound is perceived as the holy sanctuary for the Muslims, is run by the Muslim Waqf. But the Muslim Waqf run it. They say who can pray there, how you can pray there, what hours you can pray there. But to uphold the rule of law, the Muslim Waqf define, including to the fact that you, Joel, and I, Miri, if we go up there, it's only if the Waqf agree. The police are the ones who are going to be there to upkeep the rule of law. But the Waqf define it there. Israel runs, the Israeli rabbinical courts run the Western Wall, and that's part of the status quo of the holy places. And in that sense, when Israel goes up or Israelis go up, I am limited. I'm not allowed to go up there and bring, I mean, I was just reading before I told you guys the book of Ruth. I'm not allowed to go up there with the Bible. Non-Muslims are not allowed to pray up on the Temple Mount, which is the site of that 2,000-year-old destroyed temple. And I'm laughing, I think, a little bit, and I say at the end, when you have authority, you have to be responsible. Israel has been very responsible in the last 54 years, meaning we didn't take and do whatever we want. In the heart of our unified capital city, this amazing site is run by the Muslim Waqf. Okay, doesn't mean we agree all the time. And it has been what I call an Arabic Shabab, or the young Arab youth. I like to use the term young angry men who most definitely have identity issues, challenges when it comes to work, unemployment this year of COVID-19, everything going on. And they, in the weeks of Ramadan, were running havoc on the Temple Mount. Israeli police are the ones who had to stop it.
Miri, I'm so very, very pleased that we've had the chance to interview you, to be speaking with you. Before I go further, I just want to again state that my name is Joel Leyden. I'm speaking from the Israel News Agency. The INA has been around since 1995. I've been around before that, so has Miri. Miri and I had the good pleasure of serving together in the IDF. And I just want to go back. Oh, and before I go back, again, please, if you're watching this at home in Israel and the sirens go off, please turn your computer off or bring it with you into your Heder HaTum, into your sheltered room. Please, I beg of you to do that. Again, to take a step back, as if I was asking you a question from London or from New York. In one word, is Israel occupying East Jerusalem?
No, Jerusalem is a unified city.
All right. And in one word, does Israel restrict the freedom of Muslims to pray in Jerusalem?
Israel does not restrict the freedom to pray of any religions, including the Muslims, both in Jerusalem and throughout the state of Israel.
Okay. So now getting back to Jerusalem, and I hate to project, but I guess it's my Israeli blood that forces me to. Hamas all of a sudden starts to, not all of a sudden, Hamas has been firing rockets into Israel for a long time. But all of a sudden we have a barrage. We have over 2,500, over 2,700 rockets that have been launched from Gaza into Israel. And they say that they're doing this because of Jerusalem. Is that accurate, or was that just another excuse for Hamas to try to retain power in Gaza?
I don't think of it as retaining power in Gaza. It's of giving their own raison de, their raison d'etre. Me suddenly going to French may not help us all. Hamas are, in their terms, in Hamas terms, the resistance. Who are they resisting? Israel, or as they would put it, the Zionist entity. They're not against Jews. No, they're only against Israelis and the Zionist entity, but that was me being cute for a moment on the side. So when they are out as a resistance, they need to project their capabilities to resist Israel. They're not interested in running the Gaza Strip, in ruling the Gaza Strip. They're not interested in the benefits of the 2.2 million people who live in the Gaza Strip. They're not there to build jobs, infrastructure, roads, to make it better. We've all seen over the last 6 days, we're starting to talk about the metro underneath Gaza, meaning they built an incredibly elaborate system, subterranean system, for their headquarters, the cyber quarters, the rocket launchers, where all of their fighters, terror fighters, can run in and around.
Can you just repeat that again? You mentioned the word metro. Like again, I'm playing a little bit ignorant. What do you mean by metro?
I know. In Israel, or perhaps in New York, you think of the underground and you think of something built for the benefit of the public as public transportation. The Hamas underneath not just the city of Gaza, but under the bulk of the Gaza Strip, have built an underground subterranean, we call it the metro system, which is entirely in use for the terror army. And when I say metro, it may not have trains in it, but it is large enough and high enough for the full height of people. Vehicles, small vehicles can go through it. It enables them to go from place to place without coming up. Rocket launchers, the caches, the weapons, to have their headquarters. And as you've seen, Israel has tried in these last 6 days since Hamas have started to fire against Israel from this enormous arsenal of over 10,000 rockets. We're trying to damage, it's not easy to do so, this underground metro subterranean terror city.
Again, let me just go back to Jerusalem for a second. Is there a correlation between the evictions? No one, again, I'm asking you the questions, I'm projecting again. I don't believe that any Jew in Israel is forcing Palestinians out of their homes. I don't believe that there's any racist ethnic cleansing, as they sort of speak. I believe, from my experience, having lived in Israel for 25 years, that there's a great deal of peace between Arabs and Jews, between Muslims and Jews. My experience has been a very, very positive one. That there's a tremendous amount of peace. I would say there's much more peace than there is conflict, that those who are part of the conflict, it's a very small minority, but a very loud minority. But you can go to any shopping center, we call them canyons, go to any shopping center in Israel, and you see Jews and Muslims sitting at the same tables at McDonald's and enjoying themselves, and there's no conflict, there's no tension. But before getting into that, I just want to make very clear that, is there a connection between these legal evictions? And I can't make that clear enough, that we don't have settlers trying to throw Palestinians or Israeli Arabs out of East Jerusalem. This is a legal battle. People are discussing when they purchased land. The Jews actually purchased land there before 1948. Does that land belong to the Jews? And then, as we know, East Jerusalem was occupied by Jordan, and during that period of occupation, land was also acquired by Arabs, and they say that we have a right here. So we have a legal dispute. Is there a direct correlation between that legal dispute and Hamas firing rockets?
It's one of those answers where I'm going to say yes and no. Meaning, during the Ramadan, with the upholding tensions, there was supposed to have been a ruling of the Supreme Court specifically about these families, and it's a touchy issue. You just brought it up. Land ownership is a very strong issue within the conflict, certainly within Jerusalem. Who is the sovereign in Jerusalem is a contested issue, not for me as an Israeli, but for others. And as such, that's why it was heightened and shown. Last Monday, which is hard to believe that it's less than a week ago, the Hamas did something which, as an Israeli, I excuse my being so flippant, it amused me, Joel, okay? The Hamas put out an ultimatum to the state of Israel. And I was like, really? Hamas, terror army, don't put out ultimatums to the state of Israel. And in their ultimatum last Monday, they said, if the Israeli police, the Israeli sovereign, the arm of law, do not evacuate the Temple Mount, this is nothing with Sheikh Jarrah, this isn't the eviction, do not evacuate the Temple Mount within a certain amount of time, which in Israel it was up until 6 p.m., then Israel will have to take the consequences. And I give you the new day of Erev Shavuot of 6 days of 2,600 rockets fired into the heart of Israel everywhere. The first rockets were fired at Jerusalem. I think that if Hamas could have, they would have fired the rockets to Jerusalem and said, we won, we made our point, we showed that we are standing up for Jerusalem, standing up for Al-Aqsa, standing up for Sheikh Jarrah, and they would have loved it to have ended there, because they did so at 6 p.m. on Monday in the middle of the ceremonies in Israel. that were in honor of 54 years of the reunification of the city. Joel, behind your head is a big Israeli flag. We're looking at the city of Jerusalem. And the flag procession, yes, let's be clear, there are agendas. It isn't necessarily something that makes all Israeli citizens comfortable and happy. Everybody is comfortable and happy with unified Jerusalem, the city and the capital. You know, that's something which goes across the board. And when Hamas fired those rockets, they got 2 photo ops that from their point of view, they won the psychological operation. One, they dispersed the procession of Israeli flags because everybody had to go down flat. There were sirens in Jerusalem. And that was it's a psychological moment. It's what you view. Think about it. Social media, you see the picture, you decide to go in or not go in. And the second photo op moment that they got was that was at the stage where the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli legislator, were sitting on a ceremonial seat about the unification of Jerusalem, and they all had to go down into the safe rooms. Those are photo ops. Hamas does not define ultimatums to the state of Israel. And this terror army that they've tried to upgrade in the last 7 years, and all of you are going, they have upgraded, and they have, you know, terror armies upgrade their capabilities. But the IDF has not been sitting idle. I am overwhelmed and amazed by the capabilities of the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli Air Force, the Navy, the ground forces, all of the ones that we don't talk about, that have combined in the last 6 days to bring Hamas from where they are. They'll always want to be able to fire rockets, okay? They have, let's say, 12,000 rockets. They've already fired 2,500. We've destroyed, but they're going to try and keep on firing. They want to show that they can. But we have been taking out the heads of these terror armies, the ones who are responsible for firing the rockets, the anti-tank, for the intelligence, the ones who their life's experience is not about making the Gaza Strip a better place. It's not about helping the huge population there to get jobs, to have a future, to have an education. No, they built a subterranean city. That's where they invested in the last 6 days. They've been trying their hardest to damage, to hurt Israel, and they have, but we're strong, and we are damaging and hurting them in a way that we'll only understand in weeks to come.
Let me get back to that in just 1 second. Just want to ask you, as a human being living in Israel, do you feel that the majority of Israeli Arabs, Palestinians, Arabs are happy, are pleased to be living in the only democracy in the Middle East?
So Joel, that's the big issue that came up over this last week. It started already at the tail end of the Ramadan events in Jerusalem, and overwhelmingly from Monday night with the firing of Hamas rockets into Jerusalem and then all over Israel. I want to give you the example. I'm sure many of you are aware that on Lag BaOmer, and we're at Shavuot, that was, that's exactly 2 weeks ago. There was a very horrific, tragic event that happened up at Mount Meron up north, and 43 Israelis were killed. And it was Thursday night, Friday, and most overwhelmingly they were religious, mainly ultra-religious. Some I think also from North America, perhaps from some of the communities that people here know. And
just to clarify, the Lag BaOmer is a holiday in Israel. It's we set bonfires out it's a holiday to celebrate, to enjoy life. And we had a tremendous tragedy. Dozens on dozens of Jews died. This was not a terror attack. This was a tragic accident that took place there. Go ahead, Mary.
And the reason, and thank you for that clarification, the reason I'm bringing it up when you ask about the Arab citizens of Israel is that this tragedy happened up in the Galilee. The Galilee, the north of Israel, near the Lebanese border, is an area where it literally is the area where you have the most amount of minorities, full citizens of Israel who live in Israel, Muslims, mainly Muslims, Druze, a different religion and people, Christians of different sorts. There are all sorts of different, and overwhelmingly in the aftermath of that tragedy up in the Galilee, when people were trying to get back to their homes and there were buses, all along in Israel, we were saying, look, the people, as you said, the citizens of Israel, the Arab citizens up north were going out, bringing water, helping people get home, bringing food, because people were very disoriented. It was a very tragic event that happened up at Mount Meron. And that was 2 weeks ago, Joel. But I'm after
Yeah,
this week.
it feels like 10 years.
It's
Every
not
day,
just,
every day feels like a week right now.
but it's specifically about the question that you asked, because I cannot but contrast that tragic event where everybody was helping everybody and we were all citizens and we were all helping each other. And in Israel, the two groups that are perceived as minorities in our Israeli terminology are the Arab citizens of Israel and the ultra-Orthodox, who are all citizens, and they each are kind of self-secluded in different ways. And in this case, it was these Arab citizens helping out the ultra-Orthodox, these different worlds. And we all were going, wow, tragedy, but at least there was a light within that tragedy of human beings, of Kol Israel Arivim Ze Lazeh.
How about our Christian brothers?
Okay, it was very much so like that. And then this week arrived. And after the firing of the rockets into Jerusalem Monday evening, 6 p.m., it's still full light here at 6 p.m. Over this last week, we've had the worst civil unrest, violent confrontations, hooliganism, mainly done by young, angry men. But Joel, the worst part is it's both young Arab citizens of Israel. That was stage one. And then there was stage two of young Jewish citizens of Israel.
Is this spontaneous? Is this spontaneous, or is it being incited from outside?
So it's definitely being incited on both of them. But that's part of the aspect that when you ask, when did this all start? And I started and said the month of May and Ramadan and national holidays. And then you kind of go back, here we are. There were supposed to have been elections in the Palestinian arena that were actually supposed to have taken place in another 2 weeks that were canceled. It's not a democracy. It's not the exact same sort of feeling that you and I would have if somebody would cancel elections, but there had been an expectation of those elections, and Hamas had intended not just to participate, but to win hands down in the elections, both in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. We had elections in Israel, and in our elections in Israel, there have been very extreme polarizing voices, I should probably say, including very challenging members of Knesset that we have right now who have an agenda, which is very problematic. I'm going to say for me, Miri, and I want to hope for many Israelis. And I say that because it comes from both sides of the map, but in the negotiations, inside the relations, the Arab community in Israel participating in the elections, bringing in, they have a significant percentage inside the Israeli Knesset. And as I said, and then this week happened, it's just 6 days. I mean, we're on the 7th day now, God created the world in 7 days. And I feel like the composition of that aspect of the Arab citizens of Israel, that again, I think of it as the young angry men. I think of it as Shabab. I don't think of it as all of them.
Right,
but it
right.
came out in a very harsh way for those that in mixed cities in Israel. There are many cities where there's mixed populations. You always think of Jerusalem, East Jerusalemites, but the city of Ramla, the city of Lod, in Tel Aviv, Jaffa, the city of Akko, Acre up north. These are all cities that 73 years of the existence of Israel, and you have Jewish populations, Arab populations, there's the mosque, there's the synagogue, and we saw things we've never seen. The burning down of synagogues inside the state of Israel by local population, stoning, lynches. And when I say that and everybody feels, oh my God, lynches, and for me as an Israeli, it equally hurts, even though I don't like it's not, but it equally hurts that they lynched Jews and Jews lynched Arabs. That doesn't happen in a country with the rule of law. The first thing that you need, the heart of a democracy, in upholding the rule of law, you don't take the law into your hands. You don't lynch people, you don't burn down, you don't throw Molotov cocktails. And in everything happening, this was happening underneath the umbrella, can I call that, of the firing in of the rockets. So suddenly in Israel, for the first time in this last week, we've had this combination that in the home front, It's not just about going to the safe room, being safe from the rockets, knowing how to behave. It's driving in roads in Israel. And Joel, you've lived here for so many, many years in the past. And there I am, driving from the north of Israel that I just described 2 weeks ago, was where the Arab citizens helping out the horrible, tragic, what happened after the tragedy in Mount Meron. And I was driving, and I go anywhere. Okay, I'm me, right? And I was thinking, do I drive through that village or don't I? That's not supposed to happen inside this country.
Miri, I don't think that anyone who is enjoying this interview is aware that they're perhaps hearing from one of the most intelligent, one of the most enlightened, one of the most knowledgeable people in the state of Israel. By the way, Miri's not paying me to say that. The details that she's able to articulate are Miri's, and from her wealth of experience of working for the state and being an educator today. And this is Joel Leyden speaking for the Israel News Agency, interviewing and speaking with Colonel Miri Eisen. And as I'm speaking with Miri, I'm getting alerts on my phone that Beersheba is right now under attack. Areas around Beersheba, southern Israel. Right now, at this immediate moment, I do not see that central Israel is being attacked. I don't see that Tel Aviv.
Okay, Joel, when that happens, I'll be the one to leave our lovely screen. So hopefully it will happen.
So we don't need my phone to let us know if Tel Aviv is being attacked, because we got Miri saying, Joel, excuse me, I have to go somewhere right now. And it's not the bathroom. I'm going.
It is. I was hearing before, because out of the window you can hear explosions every once in a while. You can hear the airplanes, and I'm way far away from it. I've spent a lot of time over the last few days in the media, on TV, trying to explain this very complex situation, both to the international world that does not really want to frame it the way that I'm framing it with all of its complexity. And it's very, very challenging, but I have been caught already outside 4 times in sirens. And I want to tell you, when it's in a time like this, you really want to be inside in a safe room. Being outside, no fun.
Miri, whenever people bring up the word Hamas, the organization, the terror organization Hamas, or they bring up Hezbollah, or they speak about Islamic Jihad, or they mention Fatah. These are 4 different Islamic terror organizations.
Fatah, no, don't go down that road with me.
All right, but by all means, correct me.
Okay.
Also ISIS, I'm not sure how much of a player ISIS is today, but we do have several Islamic terror organizations whose only objective and goal, and correct me again if I'm wrong, in terms of, they talk about land, we want our land back, but from my perspective, it's 2 things. First of all, they're not speaking for themselves, they're speaking for Iran, who finances them. We're talking about millions upon millions of dollars being funneled into Gaza via Iran, via Qatar, via other Arab entities. Although I do have to say, kol hakavod, thank God in the courage and the intelligence of the Israeli government and other Arab governments that we've had a good deal of peacemaking in the last year. Sudan, Morocco, the UAE, Bahrain, these are our friends, truly our friends, and friends that are standing by us during moments of conflict such as right now. So the point I'm trying to articulate is that when I hear the word Hamas, I immediately associate with Iran. That's not really Hamas, which is hitting us. It's an Iranian proxy. Am I correct in that?
So, Joel, there's no question whatsoever that there's a very strong connection. But I'm gonna push back at the proxy. Hamas was founded when Iran was in the middle of the Iranian-Iraqi war. Hamas was founded before the Iranian Revolutionary Guard invented the Al-Quds Force, which is kind of like what I like to call, because I want people to understand what it is. It's the Iranian Foreign Legion to go fight Iranian battles, but with foreign forces. in honor of the Iranian revolutionary regime. Hamas is not one of those. Hezbollah is not one of those. Both of them were founded before that. Both of them have a local aspect. Hamas is a Palestinian Islamist nationalist party, meaning they want all of Palestine. They want it to be an Islamist state, but a Palestinian Islamist state. And for Hamas, their biggest enemy is actually one of the organizations you mentioned before. It is the secular Palestinians, or the Fatah, meaning you have these two, and that's two different visions, ideas of future Palestine. Fatah is the one that overwhelmingly, I mean, it was the PLO, but Hamas is not part of the PLO. Fatah is the one that Israel arrived in negotiations with. Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, known as Abu Mazen, is the head of Fatah. And Fatah right now are, in that sense, Hamas is very much challenging Fatah. And that's part of the problem. The money comes from Iran, absolutely. And Qatar. And Qatar and Iran are what I call, it's called the bad guy meeting the bad guy. But one's Sunni, the other Shiite. They don't necessarily at all have the same aims.
Miri, I could discuss this with you for hours, perhaps days and weeks, and just we could talk about China coming into an equation. I mean, there are so many different dimensions in terms of the interaction. When people say that the conflict in the Middle East is a complex one, oh yes, it is. I mean, for the most part, like where do you start, bro? But trying to simplify things and moving everything, let's say, to this evening in Israel and this morning here in the United States. How is Israel doing?
We're strong. We're resilient. We're hurting. It is not easy for us. The amount of casualties, as low as it seems in the numbers, that's the amount of people who have been killed. And then you look at the amount of people that have been injured. But I want you for a moment to think about it in a different way, okay? Hamas have fired 2,700 rockets, but there have been since last week 5,200 sirens in the state of Israel. And I ask any one of you to be in a siren once. The government of Israel, the state of Israel, over the last 15, 20 years, and different governments have built strength so that I am safe and I have a safe room. And those who are killed aren't necessarily, there's the luck of the draw, which is a terrible way, but people are being responsible. They're staying in places that are safe. We don't have a lot of casualties, and that's because the government invested in Iron Dome and the rocket interceptor, and they have been using it. Can you imagine what this conflict would have looked like if we hadn't invested in Iron Dome, if the United States had not helped fund that, if the United States has not—
Is Iron Dome working, Miri?
Oh, of course it is, but the Iron Dome is 90%. And one of the things that Hamas did over the last, in their buildup towards this confrontation, is they understood how strong the Iron Dome is. So they're firing the rockets on purpose in what I call a statistic way. If it's effective 90% of the time, then fire 100 rockets because 10 are going to get through. And that's one of the things that they've been doing, which is why you look, again, they've fired thousands of rockets, and we have had 10 casualties. We've had around 70 direct hits at buildings, and that statistically exactly shows the amazing statistics of the Iron Dome.
Now, I believe
can you imagine if all of the other rockets had gotten through?
I believe at this time, in this morning here in the States and this evening in Israel, over 2,700 terror rockets have been launched indiscriminately at Jews and others in the state of Israel. Many Israelis say, Israelis are under attack. I like to correct them. Jews are under attack. I'd like to correct them, as well as using the word jihad. There's something called jihad, which means holy war, has really nothing to do with land. And please correct me, Miri, if you find anything I'm saying here not being accurate. But we are waging a war against jihad, which is a holy Islamic war against Jews and Christians. Is that what we're facing right now in Israel? A holy war, jihad?
Joel, it depends on the way that you look at the world. And I breathe deep and I say, I'd like to hope not. I think that one of the aspects when you pose it as holy jihad is you do realize that what you're saying is that at the heart of religion, there's nothing you can do about it. That's called this religion versus that religion. Most Muslims in the world, there are over 2 billion, are not jihadi Islamists. And I really
Not
would like
violent jihad, because if you really look at the meaning of jihad, it just means you have jihad in terms of.
Jihad is not one of the 5 pillars of Islam. The 5 pillars of Islam actually include charity and prayer and commitment and the Hajj and the month of Ramadan. And as I said before, it depends on, and there absolutely are jihadi Islamists, and you've mentioned the Islamic State. When it comes to Hamas, Hamas was not founded as a jihadi Islamist organization. It was founded, it wants an Islamist state. It doesn't necessarily want to get there by jihad, but here I'm becoming, academic. I don't want this to be academic. I want us to believe that the issue is not all of the religion called Islam. The bulk of Sunni Muslims are not jihadi, but we have seen over the last decade this rise in jihadists and specifically their impact on young, angry men. And let's be clear, if young, angry men feel that they don't have a future, feel that they can't grow where they are, feel that their leaders don't represent them, feel like they can't get a job, they're not able to see anything that they feel that they are proud of, then they will be lured into the jihadi world. And so we do need to be aware that what's being offered in that sense right now throughout the Arabic world, Muslim world, this is a big challenge, and it's there. It's not going to be ended when the firing of rockets are over.
No, I think most people should be aware of the fact that the majority of Muslims, just like the majority of Jews and the majority of Christians, want nothing less than to live in peace and prosperity. I am involved with a great deal of interfaith activities. There's a tremendous amount of interfaith activities taking place in Israel and the Middle East. You could talk about the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain and Israel. I would call that interfaith activity. I never articulated that as such, but we're brothers. We really are brothers. We come from the same source. So people should be aware of the fact that there is no war between Jews and Arabs. If anything, there's a tremendous amount of peace, tremendous amount of shalom and salam between ourselves. What we are witnessing, and correct me if you think I'm not accurate here, is a minority, and a very, very small minority that's making a lot of noise. In terms of making a lot of noise, so we've witnessed over 2,700 terror rockets slamming into Israel. We're trying to slam into Israel. We've got Iron Dome protecting the Israeli, the Jewish citizens, the Christian citizens, the Muslim citizens of Israel from 90% of the rockets that are coming in. But rockets have come in. I believe as of today, 10 Israelis have died, they've perished, they've been murdered by Hamas. And then some people will say, well, Israel's response is not proportionate. Do you care to speak about that for a minute?
I'm always disturbed when people get into statistics. And so what is the proportionate response? Is it to the fact that Israel has invested enormous resources to protect our citizens? So we've only had 10 casualties. Would you feel better if we didn't have Iron Dome and didn't have safe rooms? And then it would be the equivalent, the IDF, the Israel Air Force, the different forces that have been fighting against Hamas in the Gaza Strip in an impossible arena. Remember, they've built this subterranean terror arena. We're trying to fight against them at the heart of a very poor, very dense, very heavily populated arena. And I don't want to put it in terms, I'm a mother, every child matters, and I want to be clear about that. But isn't it amazing that over the last 6 days, the IDF has attacked over 750 targets and only 200 people, and every person I care about, but only 200 were killed. We've been targeting the terrorists. And
And
they have
before the Israel
fired
Defense Forces,
2,700 rockets.
and before the
we've
Israel Defense
protected
Forces
ourselves.
targets an area, we always,
But
unlike any other nation on the face of this earth, we warn the people that they're about to be attacked. We're about to be taking defensive action against a certain building. And we just don't fire at that building and say la vie and zemayesh, that's what happens. No, we go out of our way to, we call it knocking on the roof, dropping pamphlets and flyers and letting them know, and telephone calls, that your building is about to be attacked in 1 hour. You have 1 hour to get out of there, because we know that Hamas is storing weapons in that building or under that building or somewhere in between. But when we talk about proportion, I kind of smile when the critics of Israel state, well, you have a tremendous force, your F-16s, your aircraft, and you're up against these Palestinians that are throwing rocks. So to the critics of Israel, I ask you, do you really want us to be proportionate? Should we now fire off 1,700 rockets, just fire them off into Gaza? We don't care where they land. Should we be proportionate along those ways? Because if you're talking about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that's what Israel could do. We're not doing that. We're not going
I
into
love
Gaza.
that. I think that's a wonderful way to frame it.
We are not going into Gaza to attack the people of Gaza. We have nothing against the people who live in Gaza, or the people that live in Iran, or that live in any of the so-called enemies of the Israeli state, of the Jewish state. We're going after terrorism. And those are people that attack innocent civilians. That's the definition of terrorism. We're only targeting terrorists, those whose objective is to murder me, murder Miri, murder our families, and murder our friends. Miri, where do you see us going from here?
So the term of tomorrow morning, figuratively, is that we seem to be at the stage where Israel feels that we have specifically really hurt Hamas in a way that Hamas is not yet letting out, which means that we're at a stage that we are achieving the capabilities of turning that terror army, moving it back. It's not going to make it disappear. I want to be clear to everybody. They will fire rockets until the end. That's part of their end game. But from the Israeli perspective, we understand, and we will be the responsible one, meaning that we are going to get to that stage where we have really taken care of that infrastructure, subterranean arena, the amount of rockets, not erasing it. You cannot erase it with as few civilian casualties as ever possible, always trying to stop in that sense to make sure that we are only against that terror army that have lived inside this population for so long. I would say next few days, it'll be international intervention. The usual suspects, if I can call them that, will be the Egyptians who will negotiate. They're the ones who usually step in. I remind everybody that Egypt has a 17-kilometer joint border with the Gaza Strip. On the Egyptian side of the Gaza Strip, on the Sinai side of the Gaza Strip, are the remnants of what you were talking about before, Joel, a jihadi province of the Islamic State that has been wreaking havoc in Sinai against the Egyptian forces. And that Islamic State, the smuggling of weapons from Iran to get to Hamas, very conveniently through that Islamic State, has been driving the Egyptians nuts. Remember, Egypt calls Hamas a terror organization, not just the United States or Germany or Great Britain or France. Egypt does. Saudi Arabia does. So even though they're now talking because we want to stop the fire, you want to calm things down, violence, you don't want it to be that way. So you want to arrive. And so I would say that within the next few days, I hope that we will see arriving at an end. But to be clear to everybody watching, the last photograph from the end will be Hamas firing a rocket. They won't end it until they have that last rocket to show that they could fire it.
Yo, you almost have me speechless here, Mary, and no one ever has me speechless. You're really awesome. Again, we're Joel Leyden speaking for the Israel News Agency, speaking with Miri Eisen, Colonel, retired colonel from the U.S. Defense Forces. She's an educator today at the IDC in Herzliya. I can only think of perceptions in terms of reality as it exists in Israel, as it exists in the Middle East, and as it exists outside of the Middle East, in Europe, in North and South America, in Asia. What message, Miri, would you have this morning, this evening, for the President of the United States and for the leaders of other Western nations, Western and Eastern nations?
President Biden has stood by Israel. He is a president who has an incredibly strong both understanding and background. And I am greatly aware right now of the fact that within his own party, there are other voices, and he stands strong. He knows where it's at. He has been here more times than probably most of the people watching us right now. And I don't think of it as a carte blanche. We're not the 51st state of the United States, but it is an understanding not just of Israel's right to protect itself, but of the evils, the challenges of having terror armies in the Middle East, of a Hamas, and I will say of a Hezbollah, that's up north. These are challenges that challenge not only Israel, but lots of other countries.
Joe
Germany
Biden
out there.
Joe Biden right now is being told by, let's call it the extreme left in American politics, that, they're asking him, how can you support the Israelis? They're an apartheid state. Is there apartheid?
Joe Biden understands, Joel, better than any as what Israel stands for, what we really are. And I think we all need to breathe deep, because the extremists that we have here in Israel, Joel, the extremists that you have in the United States are on both sides of the political map. And I don't feel comfortable with the extreme right who may support Israel. That doesn't make me feel any more comfortable than the extreme left who call for my destruction. So I have everybody breathe deep, okay? The challenges in that sense are on both sides of extremism. I am against that extremism. And just like you have single voices here, there are single voices there. You've had a few problems in the United States yourselves over the last few months. Here we are. Our Middle Eastern quagmire is here. And I give a message that we will be here. Not only is the administration in that sense standing strong, but the voices that we hear from the UK. So you go, oh, it's Boris. From Macron in France, from Germany, from different portions, from the countries that we care about their opinions. Also from voices in the Middle East that you mentioned before. Having said all of that, the issues that bring out the violence, okay? Some of them, I'm not talking about Hamas terror armory and calling for our destruction, but certainly Jerusalem. And who gets that honor to be the sovereign? And Israel domestically, large minority, the relations between the Jewish majority and the Arab, mainly Muslim minority, these are issues that will be with us in the day after, and we're going to need to face them. But first, let's stop with this stage where we are right now. I'm sitting here at home without masks. But again, that's part of the irony, okay? We were just coming out of Corona. We were just starting to get into the idea of having an economy of opening up, and all of this has come down on us. So breathe deep. We're resilient. We're strong. The majority of Israelis are not extremists. They're not the ones who lynch on this side and not the ones who lynch on that side. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, it's not a question to me of their being moral and legal. They are in their hearts, just like you and me. Okay, you target those ones who are trying to kill you, and you avoid wherever you can. We'll continue to do so, fully knowing that not just the United States, but good people like you stand there, that you're behind us. It's important to us, because tomorrow morning, in a figurative sense, we're going to look around and we're going to want to see where our friends are.
Well, being an American Israeli, I've got the burden of having 2 presidents and 1 prime minister, and trying to stay focused on all 3. Although I have to say the president of Israel perhaps is an easier person to stay focused on. He's like the grandfather that many of us have never had. A very, very kind man, President.
Yeah, there's about to be elections in July for our new president.
This is true. This is true. I just wanted to state also that I find it kind of ironic that Hamas has monies for rockets, for tunnels, for automatic weapons, for explosives, but they didn't have the money for vaccine. I find that kind of ironic also throughout the West Bank, or otherwise referred to as Judea and Samaria, that the Palestinian Authority did not have the monies for vaccine. I am pleased to see now that there is a good deal of cooperation between both Israelis and Palestinians in regards to the sharing of vaccine, because it's in our common good. We do intermix, we do talk to each other, we do sit down and enjoy falafel and coffee. My last question to you, Miri, for today, and boy, I could stay, I could do this all day long almost. My last question to you is, does Israel have a right to defend herself?
Joel, I have lived here for 50 years. My parents made Aliyah from the States in 1971. Israel as a modern Jewish democracy is an amazing place. It is not perfect. We have warts and pimples. We have the right to exist. We have the right to defend ourselves. We need to do it on the highest moral ground, not so that the world applauds us, but because we want to live in that country, and that's where I live.
Well, on behalf of the Israel News Agency, I want to thank each and every leader of every government that stands with Israel and stands with the fact that they understand that we have a right to defend ourselves. We have a right to defend ourselves against terrorism, as any nation does. We might be a little bit different. Not every nation has 2,700 rockets falling on their capitals, their cities, their towns. Not every nation bears that burden of terrorism. And I would believe that most nations would respond in a very harsh manner. They would just level the ground of where those rockets are coming from. And Israelis, Jews, we don't do that. We cherish life. We're targeting terrorists. We're not targeting innocent civilians. I'd like to know if there is anybody here that would like to ask any questions of Miri. We have a few people in the room right now. I'm going to unmute everyone. And I believe everyone right now has been unmuted.
Okay, there's a big barrage going on right now. I'm kind of wondering, it's getting more and more. So Joel, here it's already getting towards, a little bit later now. You can see the sun as it's kind of setting here in that sense towards Erev Shavuot. So I think that we're gonna, okay, because wow, I'm just looking right now, it's getting more and more, okay.
Now I'm looking, I think, at the same thing you're looking at right now too, and that is
Most likely.
Israel is under attack.
Yes.
Israel is under heavy rocket attack right now in the south. And how is your neck of the woods? How's central
So
Israel doing
as
right
of
now?
now, it's quiet. I'm hearing something which I think is probably the combination of airplanes and something further south from me. But as I said, we're strong, we're resilient, we'll get through this, and we will continue to build together. And hopefully, as I say, in a few weeks' time, we can talk again when the shooting is not in my head. It's really in that sense, I just heard something additional. Okay, yeah, fun. It's always the challenge of every noise you hear suddenly.
But Miri's an Israeli, and she's an enlightened, tough Israeli. When she hears an explosion outside, what does she do? She smiles.
I casually think about it and go, okay,
You will not give Hamas or any other terrorist
I will
the
not. I
pleasure
will
of
not.
showing that
I will
anyone is suffering.
enjoy, that's right. I am going to enjoy a Shavuot meal with my family, where all of us have been vaccinated for months, where we have no problem all being together, where we, at the most, if there's a siren, we will have our 60 to 90 seconds to get into our safe room. So Chag Shavuot Sameach to everybody.
Miri, on behalf of the Israel News Agency, on behalf of myself, it's been such a real pleasure to see you again, to speak with you, and to hear you articulate what is happening in Israel today. For the Israel News Agency, this is Joel Leyden. Thank you and Chag Sameach. Miri, I love you.
Chag Sameach, Joel. שיהיה לנו רק טוב. וואו. להתראות.
Erev Tov.